the Galactic Consortium for Biological Classification, an institution so monumentally bureaucratic that it made tax season look like a casual afternoon, had spent the better part of 3 standard cycles cataloging humanity. 3 cycles of poking, prodding, scanning, and generally treating Earth's representatives like particularly interesting bacteria samples. The conclusion, delivered with the solemnity of a funeral dirge and roughly the same cheerfulness, was unambiguous. Humans were Class 7 fragile life forms. Class 7. The same category occupied by the glimmerwings of Epsilon Tertius, whose entire civilization could be disrupted by a stiff breeze, and the membrane colonies of Psi and 4, who literally dissolved in anything stronger than a light drizzle. Humanity, in the eyes of 643 spacefaring civilizations, was essentially ambulatory tissue paper, with delusions of grandeur. The evidence, to be fair to the consortium's panel of xenobiologists, seemed damning. Human bone density? Laughable compared to the Krell, whose skeletons could shrug off plasma fire. Muscle tensile strength? The Morthak possessed contractile fibers that put hydraulic systems to shame. Skin durability? A Draven child had dermal plating that could deflect micrometeorites. Humans, by contrast, could get a paper cut, an injury caused by processed plant matter, which was both pathetic and somewhat poetic. Dr. Vexthar of the Crystalline Concordance had written an entire dissertation titled Humanity, a Study in Evolutionary Confusion. The abstract alone was devastating. A species that bleeds from minor abrasions, breaks bones from moderate impacts, and requires external heating or cooling to survive temperature variations that most civilized species would consider pleasant room temperature. How they achieved spaceflight remains a statistical improbability bordering on cosmic humor. The paper had won awards. Humanity was officially the punchline of xenobiological conferences across 3 spiral arms. Vicon 9 didn't care about scientific classifications. The massive trading station, a sprawling complex of interconnected habitation rings and cargo spheres orbiting a neutron star like some industrial moon, had more practical concerns: profit margins, shipping schedules, making sure the chlorine breathers didn't accidentally vent into the oxygen breather sections again because the lawsuits from the last incident were still pending. The station was a marvel of engineering compromise. Gravity plating that could be adjusted by section, allowing the 0.3G Thexians to conduct business alongside the 2.4G Draven without anyone's internal organs relocating involuntarily. Atmospheric barriers that shifted molecular composition every few meters. Structural materials rated for everything from the delicate touch of gaseous beings to the thundering footfalls of the megafauna species who considered gentle walking to be anything that didn't crack bedrock. The Magshastra architecture itself told stories. The lower cargo decks, built like bunkers, where heavy worlders casually moved containers that could double as affordable housing. The gossamer upper levels where beings of pure energy occasionally forgot they had vaguely humanoid containment fields and drifted through walls like particularly pretentious ghosts. The middle commercial rings where most species congregated, a cacophony of translated languages, competing atmospheric preferences, and the universal constant of someone always complaining about the exchange rates. Into this magnificent chaos, humanity had arrived approximately 8 standard months ago. Not in great numbers, Earth was still getting its interstellar logistics sorted, but enough to establish a presence, enough to work, enough to thoroughly confuse everyone. Raina Kovac had drawn the assignment through a combination of qualifications, availability, and what she suspected was administrative revenge for that incident with the coffee maker at the Lunar Coordination Center. The coffee maker had survived. The break room ceiling had not. These things happened. Her job title was Freight Coordination Specialist, which sounded impressive until you realized it meant she organized boxes for a living. Big boxes, small boxes. Boxes that contained things that would violate several intergalactic treaties if opened in the wrong atmospheric mix. She worked in Cargo Bay 7, a cavernous space in Vicon 9's high-gravity manufacturing sector, where the Draven and Krell felt most comfortable, and most other species required mechanical assistance just to remain upright. Bay 7 ran at 1.8 G. Not quite Draven standard, but close enough that they didn't complain. For Reyna, it was mildly annoying, like working with a weighted vest she couldn't take off. Her muscles had adjusted after the first month, though her calorie requirements had become the stuff of station cafeteria legend. The Krell security officer assigned to her sector, Jexlar, had nearly filed an incident report the first time he witnessed her eating. 3 full meal portions, the kind that sustained his own considerable mass, consumed by this tiny, fragile species representative who barely reached his mid-torso. He'd assumed she was hoarding food for later, or perhaps feeding a crew. When she'd finished the 3rd tray and asked directions to the dessert dispensary, he'd quietly checked her species classification on his data pad. Class 7, fragile. The data didn't lie. His compound eyes, however, suggested reality was taking creative liberties with the official records. Jexlar was, by Krell standards, a fairly progressive individual. His exoskeleton was decorated with service markings indicating 3 decades of station security, 2 commendations for diplomatic discretion, and 1 formal apology for that incident with the ambassador's ceremonial carapace polish. He prided himself on treating all species with appropriate consideration and respect, which was why watching Reyna work filled him with a growing sense of cognitive dissonance that was becoming harder to ignore with each passing shift. She lifted things, not light things, not appropriate for fragile species things. She lifted cargo containers marked with handling classifications that specifically required Krell or Draven assistance. She did this casually, often while having conversations, as though the container whose mass exceeded her own body weight by a factor of 6 was merely a minor inconvenience, rather than a physics-defying absurdity. "You really shouldn't be lifting that without assistance," Jexlar had mentioned during her 2nd week, his translator rendering his clicking mandible language into flat, concerned standard. Reyna had paused, the container still held at chest height, and fixed him with a look that he would later describe in his personal log as the expression predators make when evaluating whether something is worth the effort to kill. "I have assistance," she'd said, nodding toward the gravity assist dolly sitting unused in the corner. "I choose not to use it because it's slower than just carrying the box. The safety regulations were written for species that need them." She'd walked away, container in hand, leaving Jexlar to contemplate whether to file a safety report or a metaphysical crisis complaint with station administration. The Thexian engineer, crystalline vessel of profound thought, who went by Crystal because even they acknowledged their naming conventions were exhausting, had a different perspective. Crystal was fragile in the traditional sense. Their crystalline structure was beautiful, refracting light in ways that made rainbows jealous, but also vulnerable to kinetic impact in ways that made bubble wrap seem military grade. They worked in the low-gravity sections, obviously, where a fall meant gentle floating rather than catastrophic structural failure. They'd met Reyna exactly once, in a neutral gravity transit corridor, and had spent the entire conversation vibrating with barely contained anxiety. "Your species classification indicates extreme fragility." Crystal had harmonized, their voice like wind chimes having an existential crisis. "Yet you work in high-gravity industrial sectors. Is this punishment? A cultural death ritual I'm unfamiliar with?" "It's called having a job," Reyna had replied, probably more sarcastically than was diplomatic. but the gravity alone should be compressing your skeletal structure past safe thresholds. Yeah, it's great for my posture. Crystal had fled, literally, their containment field propelling them down the corridor while muttering crystalline calculations about impossible stress tolerances and evolutionary mistakes. Reyna had continued to the cafeteria, wondering if the dessert dispensary had finally been restocked with something approximating chocolate. The Morthak trader, Gulthrak the Prosperous, represented the third point in the triangle of alien confusion surrounding humanity's presence. Morthak were massive. Imagine if a slug achieved sentience, grew to the size of a small vehicle, developed a superiority complex, and then decided to go into import-export. Gulthrak occupied an entire section of the commercial ring, his bulk spread across custom-designed cushioning that managed his considerable mass. He considered himself a student of lesser species, a benevolent observer of the struggling, the weak, the pathetically under-evolved. Humanity, in his estimation, represented the pinnacle of species that probably shouldn't have made it past their home system, but had stumbled into space travel through what could only be described as aggressive stubbornness and statistical impossibility. The human, he would say to his business associates, his translator rendering his mucus-based language into something comprehensible, is a fascinating study in denial. They know they're fragile. The science confirms it. Yet they persist in acting as though reality is negotiable. This philosophy lasted until the day Reyna had to deliver a shipment to his sector personally, because the automated systems had glitched. She'd arrived pushing a hover cart loaded with containers, each marked with handling warnings that would make insurance adjusters weep. Those should be transported by cargo drones, Gulthrak had observed, his eye stalks tracking her movement. Cargo drones are offline, system maintenance. She'd unloaded the first container, marked for mechanical handling only, by hand. That's a Class 9 load rating. You'll injure yourself. I'll be fine. She'd been fine. Container after container, unloaded and stacked with efficiency that suggested she'd missed her calling as a particularly competent forklift. Gulthrak had watched in silence, his sophisticated understanding of lesser species developing several new cracks. Months passed. Reyna worked. Cargo moved. The station functioned with the smooth efficiency of any complex system held together by regulations, duct tape, and the sincere hope that nothing important broke on the same day. But patterns emerged. Incidents accumulated. Data points that individually could be dismissed, but collectively painted a picture that conflicted rather dramatically with humanity's official classification. The time Reyna had worked a double shift, 16 standard hours in 1.8 G, and then gone to the gym. The gym. Several Draven had been present and had watched in mounting horror as she'd used their equipment, designed for their considerably higher mass and musculature, without apparent difficulty. One had quietly left to check if humans had some kind of hidden exoskeleton technology. They did not. The time the environmental systems had malfunctioned, dropping the temperature in her quarters to levels that made most species require emergency thermal intervention. Station response had rushed to her section, expecting a medical emergency, and found her mildly annoyed that her water bottle had frozen. "It's just cold," she'd said, wearing what appeared to be a single layer of clothing. The temperature had been -15 Celsius. The Thexians present had nearly experienced critical structural failure from sympathetic hypothermia. The time someone had brought traditional Earth cuisine to the station's cultural exchange event. The dish, upon chemical analysis, registered as containing capsaicin at concentrations that the consortium's Food Safety Board had classified as mild industrial solvent. Reyna had eaten it, multiple servings. While other species fled with watering sensory organs, she'd asked if there was more. Jexlar had been documenting everything. Not officially, this wasn't an investigation. But his personal logs had grown into something resembling an anthropological study, or an evidence file for a case that reality was taking hallucinogenic substances. He'd cross-referenced human classification data, reviewed the consortium's biological assessment, read Dr. Vexthar's award-winning dissertation on evolutionary confusion. Everything confirmed the same thing. Humans were fragile. Class 7, undeniable. Except Jexlar had compound eyes. Very good compound eyes. And those eyes had watched Reyna catch a falling cargo container, a container whose mass exceeded 1/2 metric ton, with her bare hands. Not with equipment, not with mechanical assist. She'd seen it falling from a loader malfunction, moved faster than his threat assessment protocols could process, and caught it. The container was fine. Her hands were fine. Physics was less fine and was currently filing an appeal. That had been the final straw. Jexlar was a reasonable being. He believed in evidence, procedure, and the fundamental reliability of scientific classification. But he was also standing in a cargo bay, watching that evidence get bodily thrown into a waste compactor by a being who weighed approximately as much as his left arm. He'd done what any rational security officer would do. He'd called a meeting. The conference room in Vicon 9's administrative sector was designed for multi-species accommodation, which meant it was uncomfortable for everyone in a carefully egalitarian way. Gravity at 1.0 G. The compromise nobody wanted but everyone had agreed to. Atmospheric mix slightly too dry for aquatics, slightly too humid for desert species, and containing trace elements that made everyone faintly aware they were breathing someone else's preferred air. Jexlar had assembled what he considered the key witnesses to humanity's impossible existence. Crystal attended via remote projection because the gravity would literally crush them. Gulthrak had sent a representative because moving his bulk was expensive. Several other station personnel who'd interacted with Reyna occupied the remaining seats. "I've called this meeting," Jexlar began, his mandibles clicking in what his species considered an authoritative manner, to discuss the classification discrepancy regarding the human currently employed in Cargo Bay 7. "There's no discrepancy," Crystal's projection chimed. "The consortium's classification is comprehensive. Humans are Class 7 fragile. The data is conclusive." "The data," Jexlar said slowly, "doesn't account for what I've personally witnessed." "Which is?" "She caught a 1/2-ton container in freefall." Silence. The kind of silence that occurs when physics has been personally insulted and everyone is waiting to see if it'll press charges. "That's impossible," Crystal harmonized, their projection flickering with agitation. "Human bone structure would fracture. The kinetic energy transfer alone." "I have video." Jexlar played the footage. The room watched. The container fell. Reyna moved. The catch happened. Reality continued, apparently unbothered by its own violation. "Hidden augmentation," Gulthrak's representative suggested. "Cybernetic enhancement. It's the only explanation. She's been medically scanned per station regulation. No augmentation. The scanning equipment malfunctioned. 4 separate scans, 4 different machines, all confirming she's biologically standard for her species." "Then your species classification data is wrong," someone else offered. "The consortium doesn't make mistakes of that magnitude," Crystal insisted, though their projection was now cycling through colors that suggested internal debate. Humanity was studied extensively. The fragility assessment is accurate. "Then explain the video." Nobody could. The meeting devolved into circular arguments, appeals to authority, and one suggestion that humanity had somehow hacked the fundamental laws of physics, which was dismissed only because nobody could figure out how that would work mechanically. Jexlar, feeling his grip on rational thought slipping like a poorly secured cargo load, made a decision that was either brilliant or catastrophically stupid. Time would tell. Time and possibly the station's legal department. "I propose a demonstration," he announced. "Controlled conditions. Verifiable results. We test human capabilities directly instead of relying on classification data that's clearly incomplete." "You want to experiment on a sentient being?" Crystal's projection turned a scandalized shade of red. "I want to give her the opportunity to prove her capabilities, with her consent, obviously. And if she refuses, she won't." Jexlar was correct, though not for the reasons he expected. When he approached Reyna with a proposal, carefully worded, emphasizing the voluntary nature, including multiple safety disclaimers, she'd listened with an expression that cycled through confusion, disbelief, and then settled on something that looked suspiciously like malicious glee. "Let me get this straight," she'd said. "You want me to prove that humans aren't fragile?" "To demonstrate your species' actual capabilities, yes. The classification seems inaccurate. And you'll set up tests. Reasonable assessments appropriate for your actual functional capacity." She'd smiled. Humans smiled when happy. They also smiled when plotting something, which made their facial expressions diplomatically hazardous. "Sure. Why not? Sounds fun." Fun was not the word Jexlar would have chosen, but he appreciated her enthusiasm. He began making arrangements, filing the appropriate permits, and trying not to think about how his career would look if this went catastrophically wrong. Word spread through Vicon 9 with the speed of gossip in a confined space station, which is to say, faster than light travel and twice as impossible to stop. The human was doing a demonstration, the fragile one, from Cargo Base 7, the one who ate thermal detonators for breakfast. Wait, no, that was wrong, someone correct the rumor. The one who ate spicy food that could strip paint. Betting pools formed. The Draven ran odds on whether she'd use hidden equipment, 3.1 in favor. The Thexians wagered on how quickly medical intervention would be needed. Under 5 minutes was the popular bet. The Morthak Collective Intelligence put money on the whole thing being an elaborate hoax involving holograms and misdirection. Station Command, in a rare moment of solidarity, decided not to interfere. Commander Thexiron, a four-armed Vex who'd seen enough strange things in 30 years of station management to develop a philosophical immunity to surprise, approved the event with one condition. Keep it contained to Cargo Bay 7. If she breaks something expensive, it comes out of your department budget. Jexlar had agreed, trying not to think about what breaks something might entail. The day arrived with the inevitability of tax audits and heat death. Cargo Bay 7 had been cleared of active shipments and filled instead with spectators. Dozens of species, representing the station's cosmopolitan population, crowded the observation galleries. The bay's gravity plating held steady at 1.8 G, which meant most attendees were watching via remote drone or from behind the reinforced viewing ports in standard gravity. Crystal attended via projection, naturally. Gulthrak had actually moved his considerable bulk to watch in person, which several people noted for the historical record. Jexlar stood in the bay proper, his exoskeleton bearing the gravity load without complaint, beside several containers and equipment he'd selected for the demonstration. Reyna arrived wearing her standard work coveralls, looking like someone about to do routine cargo management rather than challenge the fundamental assumptions of galactic biology. She waved at the observation galleries, saw the crowd, and her expression suggested she was reconsidering her life choices. Too late now. Jexlar approached with a datapad containing his carefully prepared assessment protocol. "We'll start simple," he explained. "Basic load bearing. This container," he gestured to a modest cube, maybe a meter per side, "is rated at 200 kilograms, standard Krell handling weight for routine lifting. For your species classification, it should require mechanical assistance." Okay. Reyna walked to the container, gripped the built-in handles, and lifted. Not struggled, lifted. Clean motion, stable hold, no apparent effort. She held it at chest height. How long? Jexlar checked his datapad, discovered his test protocol hadn't specified duration because he'd expected her to not be able to lift it at all, and improvised. 30 seconds. She held it. Cameras recorded. The betting pools shifted odds. 30 seconds elapsed. Next test. She set the container down with less noise than Jexlar made when he walked. They progressed through his prepared assessments. Endurance testing. She carried loads across the bay until Jexlar got tired of watching. Reflex evaluation. She caught thrown objects with accuracy that made the Draven nervous because those were hunting prey responses. Gravity tolerance. They increased the bay plating to 2.0 G, then 2.2 G. And she continued working until someone pointed out that they were exceeding safety margins for the equipment, not the human. The crowd watched in progressive silence. Crystal's projection had frozen on a single color, suggesting complete cognitive overload. Gulthrak had extended his eye stalks to maximum length, which his species only did when reality had become personally offensive. Jexlar was running out of prepared tests and running high on growing dread about what the classification data had actually gotten wrong. He looked at his datapad, looked at Reyna, who was barely breathing hard despite an hour of what should have been extreme physical stress. Looked at the containers, the equipment, the bay itself. I don't understand, he admitted, his translator rendering his confusion into standard. The data says you're fragile, demonstrably fragile. But you've passed every assessment at levels exceeding your classification by orders of magnitude. Maybe your data's wrong, Reyna suggested, not unkindly. The consortium doesn't make mistakes. Every organization makes mistakes. Not about fundamental biology. You want me to prove I'm human? No augmentation? No tricks? Her expression had shifted into something dangerous. Not threatening. Humans and Krell didn't fight the same way, but determined in a fashion that suggested bad decisions were about to be made. And she was driving. That won't be necessary. No, I think it is. She looked around the bay, at the crowd, at the containers and equipment, at the floor itself. The floor, rated for heavy cargo impacts, built to handle the weight of full Draven cargo loaders, reinforced with materials that cost more than Jexlar's annual salary. Something in her posture changed. Coiled. Humans were persistence hunters on their evolutionary history. He'd read that in the assessment data, filed under compensatory survival mechanisms for fragile species. They tracked prey over long distances, outlasted faster but weaker species through sheer stubborn refusal to stop. That's what he saw now. Not a fragile being. A persistence hunter who'd been called fragile for 8 months and was terminally done with everyone's concern. You want proof I'm human? Reyna repeated. She made a fist. Humans did that for several reasons. Communication, emphasis, and, historically, hitting things. Jexlar's threat assessment protocols were suddenly screaming in a frequency that his species associated with predator warnings. Wait. Reyna punched the floor. Time did something non-linear. The impact happened in silence. No, not silence. The sound came after. The crack of kinetic energy transfer, of reinforced composite material meeting force it wasn't rated for. The floor, that beautiful, expensive, rated for meteor impact floor, cracked. Not a small crack. Not a cosmetic stress fracture. A spiderweb of structural failure spreading from the impact point. Jagged lines racing across the bay floor like lightning frozen in metal and ceramic. The sound finally caught up. A thunderous boom that set off proximity alarms and made half the observation gallery flinch. The crack widened, expanded. A section of floor plating, approximately 3 meters in diameter, gave up its structural integrity and collapsed into the maintenance level below with a crash that echoed through the bay like the universe laughing. Reyna stood at the edge of the crater, shaking out her hand. Not bleeding, not broken, just flexing her fingers like someone who'd punched something slightly harder than intended. "Still think I'm fragile?" she asked into the absolute silence. The silence held. Nobody breathed. Several species literally couldn't breathe, and still nobody moved. Crystal's projection had crashed. Gulthrak's eye stalks had retracted completely, which meant his species was experiencing cognitive shock. Jexelar's exoskeleton had developed a stress crack of its own across the thorax section, which was impossible because he wasn't the one who'd been punched. Station alarms began wailing. The atmospheric sensors had detected the breach between bay and maintenance level. Emergency bulkheads started closing. Automated damage control protocols launched with the enthusiasm of systems that finally had something to do besides run diagnostics. Engineering teams mobilized. Station Command's communication systems lit up like a festival. Commander Thexeron's voice cut through the chaos with the weariness of someone whose insurance premiums just became theoretical. "Cargo Bay 7. Report status. Did something explode?" "Not exploded, Commander." Jexelar managed, his translator stuttering. "Structural failure." "Equipment malfunction?" "Human malfunction." "Explain." How did one explain that a Class 7 fragile life form had just punched through reinforced flooring rated for kinetic impacts that would liquefy most biological matter? How did one file that incident report? What category did that even fall under? "I'll need to submit a detailed report," Jexelar said. Reyna, standing beside the crater like an extremely apologetic natural disaster, waved at the nearest camera. "This is definitely my fault. I got carried away. I'll pay for damages." "You'll pay for—" Jexelar stopped, rebooted his thoughts. "How did you do that?" "I punched the floor." "Humans can't punch through military-grade composite flooring. Apparently we can." She looked at her hand, flexing it again. "Though to be fair, I don't recommend it. That hurt." "It hurt?" "Yeah, my knuckles are going to bruise." She displayed her hand. The skin was red, slightly abraded, but categorically not destroyed in the manner that should occur when flesh impacts materials designed to resist plasma cutters. Something in Jexelar's worldview made a sound like breaking crystal. Not loud, just final. The aftermath was administrative chaos served with a side of existential dread. Engineering teams swarmed Cargo Bay 7, shoring up the breach, analyzing the impact point, and having quiet nervous breakdowns when they calculated the force required to break that particular floor rating. Medical teams examined Reyna and found minor bruising that was already healing faster than their treatment protocols recommended. Station Command demanded explanations. Jexelar, sitting in Commander Thexeron's office, tried to provide them. "She's listed as Class 7 fragile," he repeated for the 5th time, as though saying it enough would make reality agree. "She punched through the floor," the commander replied. Their forearms crossed in various expressions of disbelief and budgetary despair. "Yes. The floor we paid extra for. The reinforced floor. The floor that could theoretically survive a kinetic bombardment." "That floor, yes." Commander Thexeron made a sound that the translator couldn't quite process. "How?" "I don't know." But others wanted to know. Crystal had rebooted their projection and was now vibrating through the entire visible spectrum, which meant they were thinking very hard and probably having several minor existential crises. They'd pulled humanity's classification data, the consortium assessment, Dr. Vexthar's dissertation, and were cross-referencing everything against the video of a human-sized crater. The math wasn't mathing. The biology wasn't biologying. Something was catastrophically wrong with either their understanding of humans or their understanding of physics, and both options were uncomfortable. Gulthrak the Prosperous, having recovered his eye stalks and his composure, had a simpler theory. We measured wrong. You can't measure wrong about basic structural integrity, Crystal argued. No, not the floor. We measured humans wrong, the entire classification. We measured them against our standards. That's how classification works. But what if our standards don't apply? That question hung in the station's recycled air, like an uninvited guest at a diplomatic function. What if, in cataloging humanity's fragility against the standards of species evolved on worlds with different gravity, different atmospheric pressure, different fundamental environmental stresses, the consortium had made the single greatest oversight in xenobiological history. Someone, probably Crystal because they were methodical about these things, pulled Earth's planetary data, really looked at it instead of filing it under unremarkable terrestrial planet and moving on. 1.0 g gravity. Except most spacefaring species had evolved under 0.6 to 0.8 g. Earth's was 40% higher. Oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere at 101.325 kilopascals. Except most habitable worlds ran closer to 70 or 80 kilopascals. Earth's atmospheric pressure was crushing by comparison. Temperature ranges from -50 to +50 Celsius, with regular fluctuations. Most species maintained environmental consistency within 10-degree ranges and considered anything else extreme weather events. Tectonic activity, volcanic events, an oversized moon causing massive tidal forces, radiation from a main sequence star that required biological UV protection, and an ecosystem full of megafauna, apex predators, parasites, diseases, and environmental hazards that made other planets' dangerous wildlife look like petting zoos. Earth wasn't a planet. Earth was a nightmare dressed as real estate. And humans had evolved there, had adapted to it, had survived not despite the crushing gravity, toxic atmosphere, and homicidal biosphere, but because of them. The consortium had measured human fragility against species from gentle worlds, species that had never needed to develop the structural redundancy, the healing factors, the sheer biological stubbornness required to survive on a planet actively trying to kill its inhabitants. They'd called humans fragile because human bones broke easier than Krell exoskeletons. But Krell exoskeletons had evolved for defense against predators. Human bones had evolved to carry weight in high gravity while maintaining mobility and flexibility. Different solutions to different problems. They'd called humans weak because human muscles didn't match Morthak contractile strength. But Morthak had evolved in 0.6 g with minimal temperature variance. Humans had evolved to run prey to exhaustion in variable gravity, extreme temperatures, and thin oxygen at altitude. They'd called human skin fragile because it lacked dermal plating. But human skin could regulate temperature through perspiration, heal from injuries that would kill other species, and survived UV exposure that would sterilize Thexian crystalline structures. Fragile. The consortium had labeled humanity fragile because they'd measured strength by the wrong metrics. Dr. Vex Thar of the Crystalline Concordance received an emergency message from Vicon 9. Their dissertation, the award-winning analysis of human evolutionary confusion, needed corrections. Major corrections. The kind that would require retracting papers and issuing apologies, and possibly hiding from academic conferences for a few cycles. The message included video of the cargo bay incident. Dr. Vex Thar watched it 3 times, performed the kinetic calculations, checked their math, and then filed a formal request to reclassify humanity. Not as Class 7 fragile, as Class 2 Death World survivor. The classification few species achieved, reserved for beings evolved on planets hostile enough that survival itself was a competitive sport. The Draven were Class 2. The Krell were Class 3, which was still impressive. Most civilized species fell between Class 4 and Class 6. Class 7 was for delicate flowers. Class 2 was for things that made flowers extinct and then felt mildly bad about it. The reclassification request included detailed analysis, revised assessments, corrected calculations accounting for Earth's actual environmental conditions, and a note added personally by Dr. Vexthar that simply read, "We apologize for the error. We didn't realize humans evolved on a planet that counts as a galactic hazard." Back on Vicon 9, Reyna returned to work. The floor in Cargo Bay 7 was being repaired, which would take 3 weeks and cost enough money to fund a small colony. She'd been moved temporarily to Bay 4 while repairs progressed. Someone had posted a sign near her workstation, handwritten, probably as a joke, in Standard and 3 other major languages. "Caution. Death World species. Do not startle. May break station." She'd laughed when she saw it. Found it funny in the way humans found most things funny, with an edge of acknowledgement that the universe was ridiculous and the only sane response was to laugh or cry. And laughing was easier on the sinuses. Jexelar had approached her during a break, his exoskeleton still showing that stress fracture he hadn't gotten fixed yet. "I owe you an apology," he'd said. "For what?" "Doubting your capabilities? Treating you as fragile when you clearly aren't." "To be fair," Reyna replied. Leaning against a container rated for weight loads, she now understood she exceeded in sheer impact potential. "I am fragile, compared to what I could be. Humans break. We just break other things first." "That's terrifying." "Yeah, we get that a lot." They'd stood there in the cargo bay, Krell and human, representative species of the galactic order and the new arrivals who'd punched a hole in more than just flooring. The station hummed around them with the sounds of commerce and industry and life continuing, because that's what life did. The consortium's reclassification would take months to filter through the bureaucracy. New safety guidelines would be written. Workplace accommodations would be adjusted. Human sections of stations would be built to different specifications, accounting for species that didn't break as easily, as expected, but absolutely would break things if insufficiently contained. And somewhere, in administrative offices across the civilized galaxy, someone would update humanity's entry in the great catalog of known species. Would change that classification from Class 7 to Class 2. Would add notes and warnings and revised assessments. Would remember the day they learned that fragile was always relative, and sometimes the species that seemed most delicate was simply operating under different rules, from a different world, and with different ideas about what constituted reasonable levels of force. Reyna finished her shift, logged her hours, grabbed dinner from the cafeteria, where the staff had stopped asking if she was sure about the spice levels and just gave her the capsaicin with a weary acceptance of her choices. She returned to her quarters in the human section, where the gravity was a comfortable 1.0 G. The temperature was a balmy 22 Celsius, and the atmospheric pressure felt like home. Tomorrow she'd work another shift, move more cargo, continue existing in a galaxy that was still recalculating its assumptions and probably would be for a while. But tonight, she pulled up her personal communicator and sent a message to Earth, to her family. Just an update about her day. "Hey, everything's fine here. Station work is good. Had a little incident where I accidentally broke part of the floor, but they're fixing it. Apparently humans are being reclassified as Death World species, which is hilarious. Also, aliens are weird. Miss you. We'll call next cycle." She sent the message, sat back, smiled to herself in the quiet of her quarters. Outside, Vicon 9 orbited its neutron star, a monument to cooperation and commerce, a station where hundreds of species coexisted, where the strong and the weak, the durable and the fragile, the civilized and the wild, all found common ground. And somewhere in Cargo Bay 7, crews were repairing a floor broken by someone they'd called fragile, learning the lesson that Earth had taught its children over millions of years of evolution. Fragile didn't mean weak. It just meant you had to hit harder to prove the point. The galaxy was still learning. Humanity had time to teach them.